All right, so what I'm going to actually talk about tonight is, at a high level, is the epilogue for Samuel. And remember, 1st and 2nd Samuel exist in our Bibles as two separate books, but they were written really as one book. Also, not really the story of Samuel. Some would say it's more the story of David. I like to think of it as the story of Jesus, because David is a type of the Christ that will come. And I don't know what you talked about last week. I didn't get a chance to watch last week's video, so apologize in advance if I repeat any information that you've already talked through. But again, I'm going to try to hit this at a little bit of a higher level, so hopefully we can avoid some of that. All right, so let's talk about the conclusion of Samuel. In chapter 21, so we're really talking about chapters 21 to 24. We're gonna see in this epilogue a really interesting repeating pattern, and we've talked about this before, the chiastic pattern, where things mirror one another as they go, sort of at an angle here. And we're going to see this in the epilogue as well. So in 21a, which is the first, I want to say 14 verses of chapter 21, it's a story about the failure of Saul. And then similarly, chapter 24, the story about the failure of David. Now, Saul's failure in this case is about how he hurt the Gibeonites. Does anybody remember how Saul's bad decisions led to hurting or harming the Gibeonites? Wednesday night is such a fun time for conversation. Anyone remember that's willing to speak out? Yeah. Yeah, so Israel had made a peace agreement with the Gibeonites, who were not Israelites. They were Amorites. And they had a treaty to live peacefully among the Israelites, but Saul, in his zeal for power, uniting Israel and Judah, he decided he was just going to kill them. And the story of David, then, the parallel story in chapter 24, is really about David bringing harm to the Israelites. Does anybody remember how David brought harm to the Israelites, particularly as it's talked about in chapter 24? Yeah, so how did that harm the Israelites? Did I hear something? 70,000. Yeah, so David decided to do a census, right, which showed that he was more concerned about his power coming from his army and or his people rather than coming from God. And God told him that that was a sin, and he gave him a choice of how the punishment would be handed out. Does anybody remember what three things God offered up as punishment? Yeah. 3 days of a plague. What was that? Yes, three months of being chased by enemies, and then one more. Famine. Yeah, three three 3 years of famine. And what did David choose? Yeah, he didn't want to choose. He didn't want that to be his decision. So God made the choice, and God chose plague, and 70,000 people died. And so it's really interesting to me, these two. Why would you conclude this book of Samuel and book in the conclusion with failure of Saul, failure of David? Anybody have any thoughts? Yeah, that's right. So prior to Samuel, God was the king of Israel, and as long as you obeyed God, everything was going to be okay. That He was the perfect king. He is the perfect king. But they wanted a king like the other nations, and so they get Saul. And they were warned what it was going to be like, right? Right? That's right. Yeah, people will let you down. They'll make mistakes that cost lives, like the Gibeonites or the 70,000 Israelites, right? The only one that you can always depend on is God. And that is really an overarching theme, and we're going to be kind of hitting that point over and over again tonight, that this book points to the perfect king, the perfect savior that's going to come, that won't make these bad decisions like Saul made or like David made. This also makes the point, in my opinion, that even when you have a king that seemed to be really good at leading the people, David, I mean, God called him a man after his own heart. If you were going to pick somebody to be your king, that's who I would pick. Oh, he's a man after God's own heart. Absolutely. Let's let David be king. Even he made mistakes that cost lives, right? So to your point, there is no perfect man, there is no perfect leader here on this earth. Any other thoughts about the bookends here in the epilogue? Okay, sort of the next parallel sections here. 21b, David and his mighty men versus the Philistines. And 23b, another story about David and his mighty men versus the Philistines. Now, in each one of these, there's tales of David's weakness. This seems odd, doesn't it? Like everything that we've read about in these two books talks about David in particular being a mighty warrior. Saul killed his thousands, David killed his tens of thousands, right? He was a mighty warrior king. Why would you end this book with two stories of his failure? What's that? He's getting old. That's true. That's right. Yeah, it's the same message that we had with the two stories of failure of Saul and David, but this time it's focused on David himself, who was God's chosen. His throne is the one that's going to last for all eternity. There will always be a descendant of David on the throne, and yet David himself was weak. So in 21b, David is involved in a battle with the Philistines. During the fight, he becomes exhausted and vulnerable. And a Philistine warrior, Ishbi-Benob, who was a descendant of the giants, nearly kills him. Does anybody remember what happens next? Someone saved David's life. Who was it? Anybody remember? No. Abishai. So Abishai, one of David's loyal men, intervenes and kills the giant. After this, David's men insist that David no longer go to battle to avoid the risk of being killed. So here we have God's anointed, man after God's own heart, mighty warrior. And where did David get his strength from, by the way? He got his strength from God, and yet we see, because he's a man, he is vulnerable, he has weaknesses, right? In the story in 23b, this chapter really it kind of more focuses, or this part of the chapter more focuses on the mighty men that David surrounded himself with. It talks a lot about who those men were and what their military experience and victories were. And it contrasts that with the fact that David's strength is declining. He's getting older, right? The strength of men, not to accidentally quote Tolkien, is failing, right? And that's, again, another point that takes us to God, who is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow in terms of his strength and his faithfulness. So, again, we see two parallel passages talking about the weakness of the one who was put into the kingship by God in order to point us to a time when God would appoint an eternal king, a greater king. There's another point here that we're gonna talk a little bit more about here in a minute, but I just want to kind of foreshadow it a little bit. that the fact that God's strength is revealed in weakness. David was weak in certain moments in his life. And again, in 21 and 23, we read about that. But through David's weakness, we see God's strength revealed, right? Because did David's weakness bring down Israel? No. Solomon becomes king of Israel. Now, it eventually falls apart, but not because any man thwarted God's plan. Everything always happens according to God's plan. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit more here in a minute. Anybody have any other thoughts about this section before we move on? Right. Yeah, that's right. But he did start to turn back the other way, right? And realize his foolishness and his sinfulness, and started to turn back to God. And I like what you said about it not being just for David, but also for the Israelites. Because in a minute we're going to talk about it also for us too, right? Which seems obvious, but I want to dig into that idea here in a little bit. Okay, so the important bit with this kind of structure is the thing that's in the middle. And the thing that's in the middle of this epilogue is often referred to as the Songs of David. That's chapter 22 and the first 7 verses of chapter 23. Now, these are like poetic memoirs, if you will, where David is looking back on his life and he's remembering God's grace. How did God show David grace? Just some examples. What kinds of things do you think David's remembering here, thinking about God's grace? He spared his life multiple times. You mean like protecting him from his enemies? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and I think that was a big turning point for David, and realize, wait a minute, you're not gonna kill me for this? Like, once he realized how bad the sin was and how much mercy God was showing him, yeah, I think these are all the things that David was thinking about. He was thinking about God's covenant promise. I think as David got older and became wiser, as he made mistakes, but then, unlike Saul, who doubled down on his mistakes, David turned back to God, and he saw what happened when he did that. I think he started to understand more clearly, okay, this is bigger than me, right? The throne that God has given me is really reserved for one who is far greater than I am. And then the last thing is related to that, just that hope for a future. Now, what's interesting about calling these memoirs is that 2 Samuel chapter 22 is Psalm 18. If you put them side by side on your computer screen and you have the same translation, there's going to be a handful of words that are different, but literally just like 5 maybe that are different. It's the same psalm. Does anybody remember? I taught a class for 2 Samuel on Psalm 18. Anybody remember when it was the 3rd class? Do you remember when it was written in terms of chronologically within the story of David and Samuel? What's that? It was after God delivered him from his enemies. So it was right around chapter 5, chapter 6. of 2 Samuel after God saved him from Saul, that David wrote Psalm 18. So it's interesting to me to think about these as memoirs. It's in chapter 22, at the end of the book, in the epilogue. So will you think about the message, and we're going to dig a little bit into it, of Psalm 22, remembering God's grace. If you're doing that in chapter 6, after you are saved from Saul, and you think about God's grace there, versus God's grace at the end of David's life, do you think those are two different experiences? Like, is David coming up with two different lists? Does he have two different perspectives? What are your thoughts on that? A bit of an oddly worded question, but okay, how so? Yeah, so for me, that's a good point. So for me, when I think of David, at the point where he is free from Saul, what do we know about David in terms of God's grace? We said it a minute ago. He delivered him from his enemies. He delivered him from a lion and a bear, from Goliath. Like Saul or David had faith in God and God only. He was the only one he trusted, and God delivered him time after time in physical situations. By the time chapter 22 is written, God has delivered him from the consequences of his sin, the eternal consequences of his sin. Not all the consequences, because we see Amnon, we see Tamar, we see Absalom. And when David is fleeing Jerusalem, remember, he has a whole different attitude about God and his relationship with God. Remember, he didn't want the ark to come along because he said, look, God may not think I'm worthy to be with the ark. Take it back and let God figure out if I'm ever going to see it again. So when he thinks of God's grace at the end of his life, I think he's got a much more profound sort of understanding of what really God has done for him. Whereas earlier in his life, when he escapes Saul and his men, it's more of a God gave me good fortune kind of a thing. That's just my thought. It's an interesting exercise to think about as we get older, how we relate differently to God. Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think that's part of what got him into trouble, was he had been the leader, at least in his mind, for so long that he could start to do things that he wanted to do, and that slowly took him away from God, right? And then, of course, he came back because he is a man after God's own heart. That's a good point. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, we're going to talk about that a little bit more here in a minute, but that's absolutely right. Now, if we're thinking about structure and we're thinking about the structure of the epilogue of Samuel, then let's also just quickly look back at the beginning. If you look at the songs of David, they really relate back to the Song of Hannah, which is in the very beginning of 1 Samuel. Because remember, it's really one book. And so when we look at Hannah's song, we see a couple of interesting points here. First of all, God opposes the proud and exalts the humble. This to me lines up very well with the the thoughts in David's song around remembering God's grace. Who did God oppose in the story of 1st and 2nd Samuel? Well, we'll just limit it to 2nd Samuel since that's the class. Who did God oppose? Who was proud that God opposed? There's one obvious answer that you're all thinking and no one's saying. Saul. That's right. Saul was proud and God opposed him. Who else? There's one other obvious answer. Absalom. That's a good answer, not what I was thinking. There's one to me that's as obvious as Saul. Who? Goliath? A great answer. David. David is who I'm thinking. When did God oppose David? When was David proud? When wasn't he? Well, we talked about the census. The census, right? God opposed him, and there was a punishment, and 70,000 people died. God opposed both Saul and David. Now, who did God exalt that was humble? David? What about Saul? No, Saul was never humble, was he? David was. That's the key. We got to remember that. I love the story of David so much because it gives me hope. To see someone that you look up to make a mistake, but then also have the appropriate response to that mistake and turn back to God with humility. And that's why God exalts David. He does not exalt Saul. Any other comments, thoughts, examples at this point? Yes. Yeah, that's exactly right. It's a profound truth, right? God designed the world this way, and that's why it's a mystery to most people, because the world does not see humility as a strength, does it? Okay, another point from Hannah's song. Despite human evil, God is at work. See any examples of this in 2 Samuel? Anybody want to shout one out randomly? Everybody stops looking at me when I ask. Yeah. Yeah. What story not in Samuel that comes to mind when we think about this? God, despite human evil, God is at work. There's one. Yes, but in the Old Testament. Joseph, thank you. Joseph. They meant it for evil and God used it for good, right? That's the kind of thing that we see with God over and over again. And then the last point, God will raise up Messianic. So this, in my mind, this mirrors nicely with the points that we see in David's songs, remembering God's grace with humility, understanding God's covenant promise that even though men are going to try to thwart him, are going to try to commit evil, to throw God off track, God can use whatever you throw at him to deliver on his promise. And then obviously they both point to Jesus. Any other thoughts on this before we move on? Okay, the Lord is our rock. I'm going to continue looking at this idea of God being the rock. And I titled this slide, Where is Our Rock? Because I wanted us to start out by talking about where the world thinks their rock is. where do you think the world turns to when they're having trouble? The government? Heaven help you. What else? Possessions, money. Money was the first thing I had. Money solves all our problems, right? You know, you hear the people say, money can't buy happiness, but it sure does help. Why is money not the rock? It can go as quick as it yeah. Oh my goodness, I'm going to tell a story on my grandma. She's going to roll over in her grave right now. My grandfather was the president of Steelworkers Union, and they had a union meeting in Las Vegas. She decided that she would put a quarter in the slot machine just to say she did it. And I still can't believe she did. She put it in there and she won $1, and she put the whole dollar back in and lost it. And she, like, that was one of her biggest life regrets. But that's an illustration of, and I've been to Vegas before for work, and you see it. People are out there wearing their Depends just all night long, just can't leave because I'll lose my luck just trying to win, and they end up losing everything. It's a sad story. That is a characteristic of money. And money can't buy us the things that actually matter. You can't get, when you die and go to heaven, you can't like offer money to get in. That's not the way it works. You won't take your money with you. What else? What is it? Power. I didn't actually have that on my list. Why is power not really the rock that we think it is? There's always a bigger fish. Right? Always a bigger fish. Power is fleeting as well. And also, even when you have power over people, it doesn't actually give you that thing that you're craving, right? The eternity that's written on your heart, can't fill that with power. I had family and friends. They're always there for you, right? You can turn to your family, you can turn to your friends when you're having problems, and they'll always help you, right? Sometimes they can be the problem. That's right. That's right. And as we've already seen tonight, people are error prone. They're jealous. They're unreliable. They make mistakes. You hear people say, hey, be kind to everyone you meet because we're all dealing with something, because we're all kind of broken or whatever. We all need help. If we're all in need of help, we can't just like magically help each other. And no matter how good a relationship you have with your family or friends, it's, again, not going to fill that void. It's not going to help you find the purpose that you were made for. Last one on my list was the internet. Tons of self-help stuff out there. You can find tons of TikTokers who are like, let me explain the latest psychological mumbo jumbo and how you can life hack your way out of the consequences or whatever it is, right? Why is this not a good idea? Yeah, it is. Yeah, so people lie or they don't know, they're not really trained. But also, even if you were to find some good material, we are not capable of establishing our own path, right? We get into trouble. We need divine help. And that's why when you look at Hannah's song, she says, there is none holy like the Lord, for there is none besides you. There is no rock like our God. And at the end of the book of Samuel, David's song says, the Lord is my rock, my fortress, my deliverer, my God, my rock in whom I take refuge, my shield and the horn of my salvation. It goes on and on from there. It's very clear here, in the opening and closing songs of this book, that God is the rock. He is the only one that is going to save us. And the entire story in between points to this. But the epilogue specifically tonight, we're talking about that, reinforcing this idea. Look at Saul, look at David, look at the mistakes they made. Look at the weakness of David, who was a good king, but still made many mistakes. What we need is Jesus. Any thoughts on this? I think it's more like a battle horn. I don't know for sure. Anybody want to weigh in on that? A battle call, like a battle cry? Yeah. Like, oh, I see. Yeah. Yeah. That's a good point. I always think of the horn of Gondor. The Rohirrim had a giant horn. Steve, Jim. Yes. That's a great point. Yeah, that's a really good point. It gives you false hope. Yeah. Excellent. Yeah, that's right. Okay, I'm going to run out of time, so I'm going to pick it up a little bit. I'm going to revisit this chiastic structure of Psalm 18 slash 2 Samuel 22. It talks about God being, David says, God is my deliverer. He starts with that. He ends with that. He says, I cried out to God, and he heard me. My enemies cried out to God, and he did not hear them. God's might in warfare, parallel to God's empowerment of my might for warfare. So David realizing that his strength came from God. David talked about his righteousness, but the parallel there helps us to understand that his righteousness was given to him by God through God's grace. God made him righteous in a sense. And then the good stuff in the middle is really about God's principles. The merciful, you show yourself merciful with the blameless. You show yourself blameless with the purified. You show yourself pure. The crooked, you make yourself seem torturous, or you save a humble people. The haughty eyes you bring down. That's the same message that we've been talking about already tonight. God will oppose the proud, and he will exalt the humble. Now, the interesting thing for me here is, and this is going back to what Tony was talking about, seeing Jesus in this. If we go back and look just one level down in chapter 22, it opens with a section of praise, and David talks about, I love you, Lord, you mean so much to me, I will praise you. Last class we talked about that being a real intimate kind of love. And when we think about Jesus, we think about this not being David, but Jesus, we see the dependency that Christ had and has for the Father. He only did what the Father wanted him to do. He said, if you know me, you will know the Father, because I am so completely dependent upon him. The next section is about God delivering. David talked about facing death and needing God's deliverance. Of course, the same thing is true of Jesus. We know that he suffered and was delivered and resurrected by God. And then the next section, reasons for deliverance. David talks about, he delights in me and he rewards my righteousness. Kept his ways, and no one has really been embodied righteousness like Jesus. No one has kept God's ways as perfectly as Jesus. So I just wanted to reinforce this idea that these songs are everything about 2 Samuel, in my opinion, but especially these songs are pointing to Jesus. So when we go back to this structure, we think about God is my deliverer. I cried out and he heard me. Think about it now instead of it being David, which we've talked about two Davids. The David from chapter 6 who just now is going to sit on his throne. David in chapter 22 is about to hand over his throne to Solomon. Two different men with two different life experiences, two different ways of viewing this passage. But even now, as we look at it through the lens of prophecy and it pointing to Jesus, God was his deliverer. He cried out to God, and God heard him. And God delivered him because he was righteous. Going a little fast now because I just want to make sure I get through the last few slides. So, one verse that I really want to, or at least part of one verse that I really wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about is verse 29, second half of verse 29. I have the New International Version translation on here because it makes the point better than other translations. It says, "The Lord turns my darkness into light." Some of the other ones say, "shines a light in my darkness." But this has a different mental image to me. He turns my darkness into light. What do you think of when you hear that? Ooh, that's a great one. I hadn't even thought of that. Are there any other passages like that that you think of when you read, "The Lord turns my darkness into light"? John 1, will you read it for us? Sorry, I don't want to discourage people from put you on the spot a little bit. Excellent. I love that verse. Thank you. Everybody else is turning to the verses. Any other thoughts? Yeah? Yeah. I love that. I actually go ahead. I actually thought, those are all wonderful verses, and I agree wholeheartedly. But I actually thought of 2 Corinthians 12:19. But he said to me, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." Because the idea behind the way this verse is worded with this translation, God doesn't just shine a light at me. He doesn't just illuminate the path that I'm on. He turns my darkness into light, which is more like the Genesis quote. He turns my darkness into light, just like his power is made perfect in my weakness. It occurred to me that once, as I was struggling with something in my life, I didn't want God's power to be made perfect. Like I was begging him constantly every day to take this weakness away from me. I'm tired. I'm crumbling under the weight of it. But that meant I was saying, I don't want your power to be made perfect. I don't want your light to shine for others to see, turning my darkness into your light. I think we have to remember that. I think David came to understand this, that in times of weakness, if God truly is our rock and our refuge, others are seeing for his glory what he's doing in our life. His power is being made perfect. Our darkness is turned into light. Just something to think about. Okay, David's last words, which does not mean that these are the last words that David ever spoke. It's really more about his final teaching. This is the first 7 verses, excuse me, of chapter 23. I'm going to go ahead and read this. Now these are the last words of David, the oracle of David, the son of Jesse, the oracle of the man who was raised on high, the anointed of God of Jacob, the sweet psalmist of Israel. The Spirit of the Lord speaks by me. His word is on my tongue. What jumps out at you? in those first two verses about David that you might not realize? Spirit of the Lord. Yeah, the Spirit of the Lord speaks by me. David is what? He's filled with the Holy Spirit. He's a prophet. What this tells us is that we need to pay attention to David and the things that he says, right? He is inspired by God. Picking back up in verse 3, the God of Israel has spoken, the rock of Israel has said to me, when one rules justly over men, ruling in the fear of God, he dawns on them like the morning light, like the sun shining forth on a cloudless morning, like rain that makes grass to sprout from the earth. The ideal ruler, in other words, is one that depends completely on God. Was Saul that kind of a ruler? No. Was David? Sometimes. Was Solomon? Not really. And it's interesting to me, this idea of the morning light and dawn, the sun shining, cloudless morning, the grass growing, the rain making the grass grow. Who makes all those things happen? Almighty God. Jesus brings the sun, he brings the rain, he helps the plants to grow. Jesus is the perfect ruler. And verse 5, for does not my house stand so with God? For he has made with me an everlasting covenant, ordered in all things and secure. For will he not cause to prosper all of my help and my desire? So David is acknowledging God's covenant with him, a covenant that we can have, which we'll talk about here in a minute. But the last two verses, but worthless men are all like thorns and are thrown away, for they cannot be taken with the hand. The man who touches them arms himself with iron, shaft of a spear, and they are utterly consumed with fire. So the wicked will be judged. Those who God opposes, they will be judged. And if we had time, we'd brainstorm who those people are, but, Goliath certainly is one of them. Saul, unfortunately, they will be judged. But what I like, these 7 verses makes me think about, especially verse 5, is verse 3 of Isaiah 55, and I've got the New Living Translation because, again, it helps make the point, I think, a little bit more clearly. Isaiah says, come to me with your ears wide open, listen and you will find life. I will make an everlasting covenant with you. I will give you all the unfailing love I promised to David. Back to what you were saying, Tony, this is not just for David. This is not just for the Israelites. This is for us. In the same way that God fulfilled his promise with David because David was humble and turned back to God, God will give us that same kind of unfailing love if we are humble and turn to him. All right, look at that timing. Thank you very much. I think this was the last class of the quarter, so all new classes next week.